There has been absolutely no uptick of interest in Astrobot. Nobody's talking about it. No one bought it. No one's playing it. Astrobot has remained completely irrelevant since it came out a couple of months ago. It didn't even really have like a honeymoon period. It had this like one small period where 2 week blitz where like every YouTuber came out and tried to say that like this is the greatest platformer ever made, guys, which fell completely flat considering these were the kind of people who ignored games like Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which were far better than Astrobot anyway, and far were from isolated instances, right? Like, what about Astrobot was so interesting and so special to these people? And it does need to be addressed to a certain extent. Like regardless of whatever the quality of the game is, the shill campaign for Astrobot was unacceptable. It obviously was an attempt at astroturfing the game into relevancy. When you actually look at the sales numbers, when you look at how many people played it, when you look at like the what the game actually is, like the praise and hype this thing got was disproportionate to the reality. I said this before when the game came out, but it reminded me a lot of when Knack came out, right? When Knack first came out, what ended up happening was a bunch of people came out and called it like a major PlayStation 4 exclusive and a title uh, that outperformed Mario, right? It was a lot of the similar playbook, and immediately people realized this wasn't actually true, right? People realized it was like a shallow, generic hallway platformer, no different than Crash Bandicoot, right? And obviously, the backlash to this was so severe at the time that it eventually became a meme, right? Knack became like a symbol for like everything wrong with the PlayStation 4 going forward. All hype and no actual substance. But when you look at what's happening now with Astrobot, like what's happened is that YouTubers are a lot more comfortable shilling for products like this. 10 years ago, it feels like YouTubers were outsiders to the gaming industry. It felt like they were doing their own thing. They were talking about their own opinions. They were making their own hot take vids, whatever, right? They were they were doing their own thing, right? If anything, they were like very contemptuous of like mainstream game journalism, right? It was YouTubers who kickstarted Gamergate and stuff like that. Everyone was watching them, like they were way more relevant and popular for this reason, right? But over the past several years, it has become more and more apparent that there is no distinguishing difference between mainstream game journalists and mainstream YouTubers. And that really needs to be talked about more because I still feel like people don't really address this and think there's some major. No, like Sony is manipulating these people just as much as they manipulate traditional game journalists, right? When you look at how game journalists cover Astrobot, and when you look at YouTube, how YouTubers cover Astrobot, what you end up getting, generally speaking, is the exact same thing. People glazing this game, even though there are far superior Nintendo Switch games out there, right? And again, like I can't emphasize enough, you never see these people come out and do this for Nintendo games. It's always some flavor of the month thing or a PlayStation exclusive, right? Every single time they'll come out and worship these games and act like there's some like major defining industry classic. And the idea of this, the purpose of it, is to distract general audiences from realizing just how much better Nintendo content is, right? You do not realize that Nintendo games are better unless you spend a significant amount of time playing all of their games. So the purpose of this is to create this illusion that PlayStation is competitive, that it's putting out bangers, that they're fixing their problems. That's definitely one of the things I've heard about Astrobot is that like, ooh, Sony's learning from their mistakes. They're gonna put out more games like this. They're gonna compete with the Nintendo mascot platformers. But like, it's all just a big cope, really. When you really look at at what like Astrobot is doing. Like you just come away feeling that this is just a very shallow imitation of the Nintendo model. It's not a straight up copy like Power World. I wouldn't go that far. It's actually one of the reasons I haven't really been like condemning Astrobot the way I have like a lot of other products. At the very least, I think Astrobot probably was the best game nominated for the Game of the Year, the Game Awards this year. But like when you look at like what its actual competition is, right? When you look at like what this game is actually competing with in its own genre, like you really do get this sense that if its audience really loved Astrobot that much, they would be more interested in like other games like it, other games like it on Nintendo hardware. But they didn't do that. Instead, Astrobot fans kind of did this thing where they were just like, no, Astrobot is bigger and better than every Mario game ever made. It outperformed every Mario game. It outperformed. Yeah, I remember early on when they were trying to tell us that like Astrobot outperformed Mario Wonder and that like it was higher quality than any Mario game ever. Both of which were completely false claims, but at the same time, they tried to do it. They tried to make this a thing. And not a lot of people like spoke out against it. I did. I was very vocally opposed to the coverage of the game. But like most people were perfectly fine just sitting there being like, yeah, Astrobot, it's legitimately good, guys, without like really addressing like the elephant in the room. Like, yeah, okay, if it's good, that's fine, but better than every Mario game ever good? Like, no. Like that obviously was a load of crap from the start, and yet so many people went along with it and pushed it as the defining narrative. And they're gonna try to stick with that going forward, right? They're gonna try and say that like Astrobot is some viable competitor to Super Mario, but the reality is quite a bit different, right? The reality is PlayStation's iconography and its history, they absolutely cannot compete with Nintendo's legacy. Like it's really not even close. The fact that people like seriously tried to promote Astrobot as being like it's a celebration of Nintendo's of PlayStation's history, that made me laugh because PlayStation doesn't really have a history. All PlayStation has is a bunch of titles that people pretended were good before moving on to the next like slop, right? Or stop playing games entirely, usually. Uh, like PlayStation just wasn't ever really relevant or really competitive with Nintendo. And now we're seeing like a very clear-cut case of what their competition with Nintendo actually looks like, right? What we're seeing is them like paying a bunch of YouTubers and journalists to shill Astrobot. They straight up gave it a Game of the Year award to try and make the game relevant. And yet it just didn't go anywhere. Astrobot's not going to skyrocket in popularity. It's not going to eclipse Mario in popularity. Like every other major PlayStation platforming series, is going to fall completely by the wayside at some point, and eventually people are going to start mocking it for like for the way it's being treated, right? This is the same thing that happened to Knack back in the day, right? Jack and Daxter, Crash Bandicoot, right? Like this kind of behavior isn't going to get them anywhere, right? Like I think this is the beginning of the end of PlayStation as a brand because to me it shows that they're getting increasingly desperate. Like they are propping up games that no one is playing or talking about to try and dismantle Nintendo's hold over like the platforming market, and it simply is not going to work.